Welcome into the Dino Construction Podcast. I'm Justin, joined by David today. JP is not joining us. He is somewhere on a beach sipping fruity, delicious drinks in Florida. Now, he's more of a beer guy, but I'm sure he's having at least something with an umbrella on it. Mine's as well, right? So, just David and I here today. We actually just met in person after knowing each other for about
Yeah,
4 years. Did an escape room together 2 days ago. We made it out in time, so that's why we're still here. Otherwise, we would be dead.
it's
So
true. That's Norm what I got us.
it was a good time. I was sweating a little bit, not gonna lie. I sweated more doing that than I usually do at the gym. So lots of fun. Today, we're going to have a little bit of a redraft focused episode, some bits about how we can apply our dynasty theory into redraft, as well as focusing on it, because it's that time of year. And we want to start switching a little bit to a redraft mindset. Having a little bit of that redraft mindset in dynasty helps us win championships. We need to score points. David, can you go ahead and start us off with last week's community question?
All right. Yeah. So last week's community question: in what ways can you apply your dynasty process to the redraft format? Justin, you want to go ahead and read our first response?
Good friend of the show, Awesome Dumpling. I've been thinking about this a lot. In the past, I always ignored rookies unless they were can't miss. Now I can identify who has a higher chance to contribute this season and pick them up in later rounds. I also think that the backup RB trick could be something to be applied to redraft. Rostering a bunch of backup RBs to trade to people when their RBs get hurt might be a winning strategy. Yeah, absolutely. That backup RB strategy, it has to change a little bit in redraft. I'll get into that a little bit more later. That's just because you don't have so many roster spots, right? In redraft, you can't roster 15 backup RBs because your whole roster is often 15 players, right? But that's definitely an opportunity for increased value. 100% great point. And what is our next response there, David?
Yeah. So this one's from Trav Bob. For redraft, we have to remember oldies are goodies. Jonathan Brooks in Dynasty is great, but in redraft as an early pick, it can be rough. Also in Dynasty, we know about age cliffs, so we can apply that to redraft. Yeah, I want oldies like a Derrick Henry or Cooper Cup, but I don't want to overinvest in redraft because they could have just lost it. I think those are very good points and also things we will expand on shortly. Justin, you want to go ahead and give your thoughts?
Yeah, so focusing on the opposite of the age cliff, I think one thing in Dynasty that we are very tuned into that gives us just a little bit of an edge, I think less of an edge that it used to, is just knowing kind of the breakout year two players. I think we're a little bit more tuned in, of course, with X and everything and all the other podcasts and stuff. Everyone is talking about and beating to a dead horse all the breakout players. But you do have to remember in redraft, not everybody is as tuned in. They haven't been listening to Dynasty podcasts all summer, they haven't been on X. There's a lot more casuals. So I do think in your home league, identifying and trying to take a couple swings on breakout players is really a important thing to do. Also, I think as dynasty players, we're a lot more tuned in the second half of seasons than a lot of redraft players are. I know like the ballers, the fantasy footballers talk about this a lot that not tuning out at the end of the season is really important. And dynasty players, we don't because we want to know what players are good going into year two. So some names that come to mind, Zay Flowers was wide receiver 12 from weeks 12 to 18. Jaden Reed was wide receiver 10 from weeks 10 to 18. Wide receivers are typically finishing very strong or have the ability to. So we know one of two things, like these two guys finished strong last year. There's a good chance, like if you look at like Amon-Ra St. Brown's rookie year, he also had a crazy start. I'm not saying these guys are going to be Amon-Ra St. Brown, right? He had a great finish to his first year. These guys had great finishes to their first years. Of course, there were some injury issues, right? We know Mark Andrews was out. We know that Christian Watson was out, but they still did really good things on the NFL field, which is hard to do. So I think we are a little bit more tuned into that type of stuff and know which guys might be better bets. And building off of that, right? Having the fact that we pay attention to wide receivers and young players so much, we also know that these rookie wide receivers that have decent opportunity. So think a names that come to mind. A Lad McConkey has great opportunity this year. Is a guy that we probably can expect to do better the second half of the year just because wide receivers learning NFL offenses typically do better the second half of the year. So just knowing that that bet on rookie wide receivers in the second half of the year is a lot better bet, of course, not reinventing the wheel with either of these things, right? The year two breakout and wide receivers, rookies do better in the second half of the season are just things that I think we as dynasty players are more tuned into and a really great place for opportunity. And then what Awesome Dumpling was talking about with the backup RBs, I usually like to run my roster construction in redraft about the same as I do in dynasty. which is however many wide receivers the most I can start. Let's say if it's 2 wide receivers and a flex, which a lot of redraft leagues for some reason are so shallow, I like to have those 3 wide receivers that are in my starting lineup and then 1 or 2 more. So 4 to 5 wide receivers at the absolute most. Possibly like, if you have defenses and stuff, like maybe you're holding multiple defenses, never 2 kickers. At quarterback, I prefer to only have 1 quarterback if it's a 1 QB league. I don't like to hold a second one. And then I like to have a bunch of running backs on talented offenses. So think like an Elijah Mitchell type, right? Guys like that, Ty Chandler, because we have Aaron Jones, injury concerns, of course. So backup running backs, awesome. Dumpling, 100% correct. You're limited on them. So it's not every backup RB. It's the ones that you think can be like the ones that you think the offense is going to potentially produce a difference making type of role. Guys that you think will walk into a workhorse role or high scoring offenses. Those two things are probably two of the bigger like takeaways that I have as a taking my dynasty and roster construction knowledge into lineup is that after like those elite wide receivers, right? Especially in redraft, you can always find a Josh Palmer type on waivers. It might not be Josh Palmer, but it's somebody who the Josh Palmer of past years, right? Someone who's going to do good things for you. So you're a lot better off taking your chances at running backs, I think, than fringe wide receivers in your 5th wide receiver spot because you're never going to start them over the guys you drafted to start, or at least very rarely. David, how do you kind of use your dynasty knowledge in redraft?
Yeah, I think you touched on a lot of things that I was going to mention here. So I'll just expand on a couple of those thoughts. Obviously, like you said, the depth of knowledge we have from just paying attention is a big advantage as long as you know how to slightly adjust it, tune it just slightly. As Trav Bob mentioned, the oldies are the goodies. Future value means nothing in redraft. So I think that's the biggest adjustment we have to make. I do think doing like a couple of underdog drafts or even a couple mock drafts, even though mock drafts are kind of meaningless, I think that does help you adjust mentally from where your startup brain is at to kind of lower the value of some of those younger players and raise the value of some of those veteran producers. So I do recommend doing that just as a nice exercise. We talk all the time about how different lineup settings change how we value different trades, how scoring settings value different positions. That's really valuable for redraft, maybe even more so for redraft because your lineups are so much smaller. So that's another thing to keep in mind as you're going through your process. The biggest difference is just how much more shallow redraft leagues typically are than dynasty leagues. We talk about in start 9, we just want studs. Start 9 is a deep redraft. It really is. Even if you call it start 8 because it's not super flex, you want studs. Studs are all that matter. Like you said, you can find a Josh Palmer on waivers. When you get to those middle and late rounds, don't worry about taking guys that have a high floor. Just shoot for ceiling. You take a guy and you miss in your 9th, 10th round pick. Oh, well, cut him and find somebody else. You're going to be just fine. But if you hit that 9th, 10th round pick and they turn out to be a back end wide receiver 1, kind of on that note, too, positional advantages, they are much more impactful. So while you don't want to overspend on quarterback or tight end, it's kind of hard to win without at least one of those guys or one of those positions having a stud. I kind of like finding a way to get elite guys at both if you can. As you were talking about with running backs, it's definitely slightly different, but very similar. I do think zero RB is harder to pull off in redraft just because they're so shallow. Hero RB is still great, and you kind of outline the process of how we, want to build our backup running back room if that's the way we're going. Again, just shoot for upside. Like you said, those committee backs, whether they're handcuffed or not, just the guys with upside. We don't care about guys that might take over and get a little opportunity. We want guys that could take over and give you back end RB1 production or something, like Chase Brown, Zach Moss, those guys, or Najee Harris, Jalen Warren, David Montgomery. Those are all great guys to have as your RB2, 3, 4, whatever, in a hero RB build. And that kind of leads into roster construction, which you already touched on. So I'll just kind of add a couple of things that I think were important. You said you like to only roster one QB. I agree. I just don't think it's feasible in some leagues. And I think you need to pay attention to that. In my home league, they're going to draft 2 or 3 quarterbacks and they're going to carry them throughout the year. One year, I had one quarterback, I think it was Lamar, and the year he got hurt. And I had to pick up, I don't even remember who it was, but it was like QB 27. I was choosing between like 3 or 4 starters. I didn't make the playoffs that year. It was like the only year in my home league I've not made the playoffs. And it was because I didn't have a good backup quarterback. So just know your league. If waivers aren't going to be very deep at quarterback, get a second guy. Just get someone that can help you survive if you have to. But if you got a bunch of smart managers and there's only one quarterback on most teams, go ahead and just have one. The other thing is you're talking about how many wide receivers you want. I agree for the most part, but I think just because of where that cutoff is in most leagues of how many receivers are going to be rostered, you can find some good upside shots late in your drafts. So if you're betting on upside, I'm okay rostering, sixth, seventh, maybe an eighth wide receiver. Probably not quite eight, but if you're betting on upside, then it's fine. Like draft Montavian Wicks in your last pick. If he doesn't turn out to be one of the top two or three guys, you're going to know in the first couple of weeks and you can cut him. Just things like that.
Yeah, that's a great point, David. Going off of what you're saying there, I think that's a really good adjustment to that, is especially, like, those types of backup RBs that you can typically pick up off of waivers. Like, there's guys like Blake Corum, who's probably worth having on your team from day 1, Jalen Warren, names that we've already said, right? Guys that are, have the potential to be a RB1 if the other guy goes down type of role. Those guys are guys that I'd consider, picking up depending on where I have to in a startup or in a redraft draft, in the actual draft. Otherwise, you're absolutely correct. The wide receivers, even a lot of them, right, that are high upside guys like a Xavier Legette, a Lad McConkey type, right? By the end of week 1 or week 2, you don't necessarily want to, with a rookie, necessarily drop them. But say you really like Darnell Mooney and you want to draft him in redraft and just see what happens weeks 1 and 2. He's not a rookie. He knows how to play in the NFL. If he's a non-factor through a couple weeks, you're safe dropping him. Rookies, like I mentioned earlier, they do better in the second half. You may want to hold on to them unless they just look Quentin Johnson-esque. You're absolutely correct that the wide receivers, I think a lot of the time, right, you're not going to see a injury between now and the start of the season for a starting running back, knock on wood, most of the time. So I think you're absolutely correct that as the season progresses and we start to know which wide receivers are good and which ones are bad, transitioning to that a little bit more of a dynasty wide receiver roster construction as we go, with the caveat of knowing that the young wide receivers have that ability to come on in the second half. So the upside shot, once you kind of know what roles there are, we should be assuming that year 1 players are the only ones that we should expect a large amount of development between like week 2, 3, once we see who they are, and when the bye weeks start coming on week 8, 9, and they might start hitting their stride. So I think that's a really good add-on and improvement to what I said earlier. So thanks for adding that part, David.
Oh yeah, that's what we do. We help each other out.
Hopefully our listeners too.
Hopefully, that's the goal.
We believe in you guys getting some championships this year. The whole point of redraft, in my opinion, is just to pay dynasty dues, baby. Redraft's easy because we
Basically,
play
yeah.
the casuals. So,
Yeah, there are some fun, sharp redraft leagues, don't get me wrong, but when you're talking about a home league or something, anything can happen. See all those wild tweets of people with their lineups from a home league draft, and you're like, "How did that happen?" Well, it's a home league.
absolutely. All about taking money from a baby. Moving on to our next week's community question. What will we be asking the fine folks, and what will we be focusing on next week, David?
Yeah, we figured we would take the time to kind of go through division by division, team by team before the season starts, kind of do a little more of a deep dive so that we can spend a little focus on each team. So we're going to start next week with the North divisions. So name a buy, sell, and hold in the NFC and AFC North. So you can pick the same teams if you like. You can pick the same division. You could do one, set for NFC North, one set for AFC North, whatever floats your boat, whatever comes to mind. We always appreciate your responses. So Justin, you want to go ahead and let the viewers know where they can respond?
Yeah, of course. If you're watching on YouTube, comment in the section below. We love your responses more than anything in the world. Reach out to us at DinoConFF on X/Twitter. Our personal handles also in the episode description below, or at dinoconstructionff@gmail.com as well. And we will read your responses on next week's episodes. Make sure to hit that subscribe button if you're not subscribed. Catch all of that content next week as well. Now, moving along to a little bit more of a deep dive, a little bit of an analytical approach to how we can take advantage of some perhaps inefficiencies in the way that different sites have very distinct and different ADPs, and those are going to differ from your personal rankings and my personal rankings and every other analyst's personal rankings, right? So, a really great thing that we did for this was we literally just pulled from fantasypros.com, a wonderful resource. They had ADPs from Sleeper and ESPN and Underdog, as well as some other sites and cumulative sites. And we put them into a spreadsheet, cross referenced different lists that they had in separate places, focused on a couple of differences. So, the difference between ESPN, so a lot, I'd say the majority of redraft home leagues, or Sleeper might be catching up, but I think it's still definitely the majority. Sleeper redraft leagues, because I don't know about you, but I love Sleeper. I think a lot less home leagues are on Sleeper, a lot more sharp leagues, in my opinion. Let me know in the comments below if I'm wrong, but I generally have that association. And then Underdog, because cash is involved. and we like to see like what are people doing when their money is involved. So when we're looking at like sleeper versus underdog for just like linear ADP, we know that wide receivers go really heavy in underdog. So we're more looking at positional ADP. So where is wide receiver X going in underdog wide receiver ADP versus in ESPN ADP for wide receivers, because even though wide receivers go in a different order, we're now just comparing apples with apples instead of apples with oranges, if that makes sense. And we wanted to focus on looking at both players that are going way higher in sleeper versus underdog, as well as ESPN versus underdog. And we're kind of calling those players, if they're going way higher, being drafted way sooner, that they're kind of overpriced in sleeper perhaps, or they're overpriced in ESPN. And if they're going way later in ESPN than they are in underdog, then perhaps they are a value. We will also touch on, of course, a little bit of how, I mean, David, what type of players go higher in underdog automatically?
Well, the big play receivers, for example, I mean, you said receivers in general, but I think the big play receivers specifically you always hear, oh, this guy's better in best ball. Well, that's kind of reflected in ADP. The other big difference there is a lot of underdog tournaments, you're trying to beat tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of other entrants. So you kind of have to bet on upside. And like we like betting on upside in redraft, but you almost ignore anything but the perfect outcome when you're drafting in best ball because you kind of need it to hit to win that tournament. So just a couple of things to keep in mind there as differences if you see something that looks a little off if you're trying to reproduce this process yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. What I wanted you to touch on was we can't just assume that it means that they're actually a value. So we're going to try to pick out players that we actually think are a little bit of a value as well. Not just that there's a big gap, but we think it also fits as a value. And it's not just the upside play being made by a bunch of bettors. All right. So, all that being said, we are going to go into our three favorite values on ESPN. So the players who are being drafted way higher in underdog than they are on ESPN. And who are some guys you think are values, David?
Yeah, first one I'm going to mention is Debo Samuel. He is wide receiver 13 on Underdog, wide receiver 19 on ESPN. I will say I think wide receiver 13 is probably about as high as I'd be willing to take Debo. But man, if I can get him at mid to late wide receiver 2 prices, I'm all in. He was wide receiver 13 last year in PPR points per game. In 2021, he was over 20 points per game, had kind of a league winning type of year. We've got some uncertainty with Ayuk, but I think even if they hold him, got a good shot to be a back end wide receiver 1, high end wide receiver 2, which would outperform that ADP of wide receiver 19. So that's someone early on I like. And then next player I want to talk about is Roma Dunze. So we keep talking about wanting to bet on upside. We've got Roma Dunze as wide receiver 39 on Underdog, wide receiver 46 on ESPN. This is the range where we want to bet on upside. Odunze, if he ends up being the guy in two wide receiver sets next to DJ Moore, Caleb has anywhere near the rookie season we expect, he has a decent shot to put up a solid season and most likely have that finish to a season that we've talked about with those rookies last year, like Jaden Reed, Zay Flowers. So this is definitely an upside shot, but it's in that range of draft where if you miss, who cares? And those are the kind of players that I really like. And another one of those, the last guy I'll mention here is Chase Brown. He's running back 34 on Underdog, 43 on ESPN. Very similar argument there. If you miss, it's not going to burn you because of the range he's going in. But if this guy takes the majority of that backfield, he's going to outperform that by a long shot, and he's going to give you a terrific return. He's a Zach Moss injury away from that high upside case that we were just talking about. So those are my three players that I think are great values on ESPN. Anything to add there, Justin?
Yeah, I really do like Debo. I've been pretty much avoiding him in underdog because at wide receiver 13, I feel like he's capped pretty much close to his ceiling. That's where he's priced. Like he could be a little higher. He's an amazing athlete, great football player, but I don't have a big exposure, but at wide receiver 19 prices, absolutely love that. I agree with the Adunze thought process that you have. We want rookie wide receivers late in the draft. Can't disagree with that at all. And with the prices that he's going, especially wide receiver 46 versus that 39 in underdog ADP. Love that. And Chase Brown, especially with the camp hype that he's getting, I wouldn't be surprised if he actually balances out to become less of that value. I think maybe just the underdog bettors are a little bit sharper than the ESPN have. And I think if you got an early draft, take advantage of it because I think he's going to be rising in ADP a little bit. But that being said, like don't overpay. Like around where that underdog ADP is probably if he goes above that and becomes, the opposite of a value, a little bit overpriced, then we're probably looking to potentially avoid versus, we're always looking for inefficiencies and we want to take advantage of those. Absolutely. Good points there. Good players.
And you want to go ahead and let us know who you found as to be a good value on ESPN?
Not really, because when I was going over them before the show, I mean, you were like knocking me and JP's not here to back me up on my first value. Christian Kirk. I'm a big Christian Kirk guy. He's going wide receiver 36 on ESPN, 30 on underdog. So a six difference in price. So he's being drafted as a fringe wide receiver three. I think he's a solid floor guy with some upside. I think his best case scenario is probably like wide receiver 15 ish, maybe a little bit higher. I think he's probably falling somewhere between wide receiver 18 and 27, give or take, in points per game finish, getting him 9 spots below that. He's the type of guy that I like to have on my teams. I do know, like, I understand what you're saying possibly here is you could take someone with a lot more upside at that point. So when I'm looking at drafting him, it kind of depends on the build that I have. If I already have two or three wide receivers that I feel like are weekly starters, I'm probably not taking Christian Kirk. I'd probably rather take a swing on like a Lad McConkey type or a different rookie, like a Roma Dunze type a little bit later on, or somebody who I feel like actually has that like potential to really come on late in the season. But if earlier on I take a lot of boom bust players and I don't actually know for sure that I have three wide receivers I feel comfortable taking, or let's say I went a QB and a tight end and I already have three running backs on my roster and I only have two wide receivers that I like, I'm more likely to take Christian Kirk. So it does depend on my construction. But if I feel like I need that solid wide receiver two with high end wide receiver two upside in my flex or second wide receiver spot, then I really do like Kirk's value quite a bit. Next player is Devin Singletary, RB 36 on ESPN, 32 on underdog. Not a huge discrepancy, but he's not even going as a starting RB, like a top 32 R. There's only 32 teams in the NFL, fun fact, if you didn't know. So that means there's 32 starting running backs, right? In theory, right? He's not even being drafted as one of those. Of course, we understand Jalen Warren and David Montgomery, et cetera, right? Raheem Mostert, guys that are going ahead of him because there's reasons, right? We like these guys. But at RB 36 and the upside that he has to just be a solid player, like I'm going to be snagging him left and right because I think he's a little bit undervalued there. And running backs have so much injuries. I always, if they're a starting running back and you can get them in the double digit rounds or like the late single digits, just depending on your league, always a good upside play, especially because he's a talented running back. He's not a star running back, but he's a good NFL running back. If he gets a workhorse role here, he's value. And I think that the underdog people are in on that. The last guy, Malik Neighbors, wide receiver 24 on ESPN, 19 on underdog. Wide receiver 24 is probably, if I had to bet, I would say that's probably around where he finishes, to be honest with you. Unlike a Christian Kirk type, unlike most guys that are going in the 20s and 30s in most drafts, this guy has the sky as the limit, and he's the type of guy who you could definitely see coming on strong in the second half. So this is again, underdog people know all about upside, and they know all about the trends that rookies do well in the second half of the season, which is when, by the way, they make their money because that's when the tournaments start if they qualify. So they're betting on that. And spoiler alert, in redraft, the playoffs are also in the second half of the season when rookies come on strong. So I just think where he's going, if you can get him at wide receiver 24, I do think that at that point, I'm going to have a pretty high exposure to him. I think he'll probably rise a little bit because of exposure and hard knock, as well as just as the season matures, the redraft season matures, we get closer to the actual season starting. Usually, ESPN and other drafts kind of start to mirror what the money betting does, right? So they mature and the ADPs mature. If you have an early ADP, though, I think this is a really good one to take advantage. Anyone you disagree with or want to add on to, David?
Oh, yeah, I'll just kind of go through here. I think the Christian Kirk dynasty value and redraft value argument is very different, but this is redraft show, so we'll kind of stay on that. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head, though. There are certain builds where I'm okay taking Kirk at that value. I'm gonna be honest, though, especially in redraft, in that range, I'm almost always looking to take a swing for the fences. So most of the time, I'm going to go a different direction, but I do have some exposure to him on best ball. I might end up with him on a team or two in redraft, but I wouldn't be surprised if I don't have him at all. Devin Singletary, I love that value there, especially if you're doing a hero RB build. You know, he's going to be fine for your RB2 if you build it right. He's going to be a guy you can plug in on injury weeks or flex weeks if you need to, especially at that price. It's kind of hard to pass him up. And then Malik Neighbors, like you said, man, the upside is just too hard to ignore. He's probably someone you're going to be able to start from week one, and we would hope that the production just grows and grows as the season progresses, maybe even hitting an apex during playoffs and helping you win a championship. So I like those picks.
David, I'm just sitting here laughing because I saw a report. I don't know if it was Sleeper was telling me that a New York Giants beat reporter expects him to have 100 targets. I'm sorry, is that news? I like laugh. They have no depth there, of course. Like if you tell me 140 or 130, I'm like, that's we're getting into bold take territory. But of course he's gonna end up 100 targets in a 17 game season is somewhere between 5 and 6 targets, right? A game.
Yeah, that's that's not super bold of a take, but still, uh,
He's gonna have
I
some
think,
targets.
yeah, I think you could make some bolder takes that are still reasonable with him there. Maybe, like you said, maybe 130, 150 targets is a little bit more bold and also still reasonable though. If he hits his high end outcome, he can have a terrific season.
He sure could. And now, David, who are some guys, whether it's because you don't think there's the high end outcome there, or perhaps could be injury concerns that just are not knocking the price enough on a name brand player that you think are overpriced based on the ESPN ADP compared to underdog?
Yeah, I think one thing that we see often with ESPN ADP is the name value means a lot more than when you're talking about sharper leagues, sharper ADPs. My first guy maybe doesn't fit into that category, but also maybe kind of does at this point. It's Michael Pittman Jr. He's going as wide receiver 24 on underdog, but wide receiver 12 here on ESPN. Last year, he finished as wide receiver 15 in PPR points per game. Josh Downs is another year older. They added AD Mitchell. Richardson's healthy. He's going to be running a lot more. Taylor's healthy. He's going to be running a lot more. Just find it hard to see Pittman finishing above last year's finish. So you're already buying him above what I view his ceiling at on ESPN, and I just can't get on board with that. Even at wide receiver 24, like I have some exposure to him for sure, but it's typically because I like stacking Richardson. It's not so much that I like Pittman.
That's a fun stack. I have a bit in best ball too.
It really is. I mean, you don't even really need to stack Richardson to be fair, but might as well if you're getting solid value on it.
When in Rome.
Yeah, exactly. Wait, we're not talking about a Doomsday.
Oh, sorry, that was earlier, my bad.
So next guy I'm going to talk about is Nick Chubb. This is a guy who's being hoisted completely on name value, in my opinion. He's RB39 on Underdog, RB30 on ESPN. He's 28 right now. He's coming off a major knee injury, not just a normal ACL tear. We typically see it takes 2 years for even young, healthy running back, or not healthy, obviously, if they're coming back from a knee injury, but otherwise healthy running backs to come back. It takes about 2 years for them to get their explosiveness. So even if he does come back this year, we don't expect him to be his full strength. And with his age, it's very possible we never see that Nick Chubb again. I'm kind of out on him in redraft this year because of his age and injury. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, whatever. I just don't see a world where that hurts me too much. And then kind of the same thing here with Mike Williams, wide receiver 64 on Underdog, wide receiver 51 on ESPN. He's probably going to go undrafted in a lot of leagues. But man, coming back from an ACL tear, no time to build chemistry with Rodgers. I think I have him on a couple of best ball teams where I've got a Rodgers stack with Wilson, but that's the only time I'm taking him. I'm avoiding him completely in most redraft formats, and I kind of think everyone should.
No, I hear you on those guys there. I think I agree quite a bit on all of them. I'm not gonna comment on Mike Williams because I think I have a, similar case I'll be making in my overpriced players. Nick Chubb, I mean, it's just like the same reason I can't get out on J.K. Dobbins, to be honest with you. Running backs coming off of injuries that historically you don't come back off of, given the player profile, age in this point. I mean, the only person I remember doing it is Adrian Peterson, right? How many Adrian Petersons are we? We talked about this last week. There's been the one guy who really has came back. Even a Saquon Barkley, who anybody will admit is one of the best athletes at the running back position we've ever seen in our lifetimes. He struggled coming back from an ACL, right? It took him a while. And Chubb, well, honestly, he's probably on par with Saquon's athletic ability in his prime. He's no longer in his athletic prime. So you're 100% right on that one. If we were talking more about that underdog ADP or RB39 and the Devin Singletary types are off the board already, I start to understand it a little bit more, but correct. And Pittman, again, he just doesn't seem to have that ceiling. And especially in that range where he's going, wide receiver 12, where I could be trying to go like Chris Olave types, right? Instead, give me the guy who has that ceiling. And honestly, still a lot of the same floor, right? Eventually, players tell us who they are in the NFL. And like DJ Moore told us who he is in the NFL. And unless you give a DJ Moore type a upgrade, they're not going to become a new guy. And while we like Anthony Richardson for fantasy, we don't think he's an NFL upgrade necessarily, especially when you consider the volume that's coming with it. So love all those picks, David.
Well, thank you, Justin. Now, how about you for your three overpriced ESPN players?
Also, it's so much easier to agree on who's trash. I mean, we're great at that. No, these are all wonderful human beings, of course, but just the prices we don't like. The first guy I'm going to mention, just piggybacking off your Mike Williams thing, is Aaron Rodgers. Again, just the name value has him going at QB 13 on ESPN, coming off of an Achilles tear at age 753, high on ayahuasca, and possibly running for vice president. No, of course, those last two parts are probably not true, at least the last part versus 21 on underdog, which is like a reasonable price, right? A guy that you take late on. If you took him at QB 20 in an ESPN home league because you took Jaden Daniels and you just want to pick up a guy, I love that. But you're taking him actually ahead of Jaden Daniels ADP in ESPN leagues right now, which is absurd to me. I just cannot believe it. The next guy, DeAndre Hopkins, this is before the injury news came out, so I wouldn't be surprised if it slows down, but it might not because people love old names that were good once. He's going at 38 on ESPN, just got injured. He's going at 46 on underdog. I don't know where the big time upside is with the like knee injury, the age that's coming on. I have just some concerns where he's going. I think I'd rather take a shot on a different younger player. Take a Christian Watson type, take a Lad McConkey type in the same type of range of a draft that he's going based on how old he is, especially now that the injury is there. I think I'm more comfortable with him in the mid 40s, which is his underdog ADP. And then the last guy, Stephon Diggs, 14 on ESPN, 23 on underdog. I just think there's a wide range of outcomes with Diggs. There is a chance, and if you believe that he is that guy and he's still that guy, like, and you need to make a call because of you're sitting on a corner in a draft and you can't wait 20 picks and you want to make your shot, make your shot. But I'm not betting against a guy who just had a decline in efficiency in the second half of a season north of 30 and now has two other really good wide receivers there in Tank Dell and Nico Collins. I'm okay with betting him around wide receiver 23 where he's an underdog. I've drafted him in some of those, but at wide receiver 14, oof, I'm out. And David, am I wrong with any of those guys? I know I'm not, but it was
No, I don't think you are. I do think it's funny though that at the top of the show we talked about how you need to adjust based on age, and then you give me three guys who are basically dust at this point as overpriced. But I do agree with you on them. I think, Rodgers, like you said, if you're drafting him in the 20-ish, 20s-ish range, maybe he's your backup to a guy like Jaden Daniels because the upside with Jaden Daniels is great, but he could bust completely. You might need a veteran to plug in there. Taking him over Jaden Daniels is just crazy to me. Hopkins, like we said, with that knee injury, he might even miss a couple weeks to start the season. Probably going to have Ridley seeing most of the targets there because of that. And then, Diggs is a very interesting one. The upside is definitely there to pay off the price. But man, I've been talking all season about Tank Dell, how I'm a huge fan. Nico Collins just got paid. That's a crowded room. That's an expensive price to bet on the old guy who's already shown signs of decline. I'm going to overpay for a Texans receiver, I'm going to bet on one of the two younger guys there. So I definitely agree with all three of those. I think they were definitely good picks there.
of course they are. I made them, David. No, of course, just kidding. And moving on to our sleeper. Who are your three favorite values? Again, value being defined as the sleeper ADP is significantly lower or later than the underdog ADP.
First guy I'm going to talk about is Brian Robinson Jr. He is RB30 on underdog, RB36 on sleeper. We even see Austin Eckler going ahead of him in ADP on sleeper, which to me is just a little bit crazy. Once upon a time, Eckler was a stud. We love him back then, but those days seem to be long gone. Don't mind taking a flyer on Eckler late because, well, what if he found the fountain of youth? Probably didn't because nobody else finds it, but what if? But look, Brian Robinson's a solid player, man. He's a good, nice, solid RB2. You're getting him in RB3 prices. I think that discount is coming because of Eckler. He's probably not going to be a league winner for you, but especially like we've been talking about, if you're doing a hero RB build, this guy's a great RB2 to plug in. So I love his price there on underdog, and I think he's a little underpriced on sleeper. Next thing I'm going to talk about is Hollywood Brown, and really you could probably mention any of the three Chiefs wide receivers right here just fine, but I guess I chose Hollywood Brown. Wide receiver 32 on underdog, wide receiver 40 on sleeper. Look, we don't know who's going to be the wide receiver one in Kansas City. It could spread out to where all three are fine picks and none of them are elite picks. But if Mahomes finds a favorite target and he becomes the true wide receiver one there, that guy's going to be plug and play, and he's going to way outperform the wide receiver 3 value those 3 are all going at. I'm gonna spread out my bets, but I'm gonna take some bets on all 3 of these guys. I think, yeah, that price difference for me is definitely one I'll hopefully be able to take advantage of. And the last guy, kind of the same idea with Hollywood, is Christian Watson, wide receiver 40 on Underdog, wide receiver 47 on Sleeper. And this is just another bet on upside. I've seen when Watson's out there with the Packers, they like to run the offense through him. He's a big touchdown magnet. He's a big play machine. So if he stays healthy, I expect him to outperform the wide receiver 40 price tag even. So someone I'm looking to get some exposure to in redraft for sure.
Really agree with both the wide receiver takes there. I mean, that is just absolutely that type of a range where, especially if you already have your wide receiver 1 and 2 figured out, which you should by wide receiver 40s coming off the board on ESPN Redraft, take a guy with upside, like we talked about in the kind of when we were answering the community question earlier. Don't take the guy with a safe floor, right? It's not the time probably to be taking I guess, like a Joshua Palmer type of guy who we kind of know who he is as an NFL receiver, right? Sure, you can probably flex him. And sure, there's a chance you can't flex Hollywood Brown. Maybe he just flames out. But Josh Palmer is not going to be wide receiver 12. Hollywood Brown could be wide receiver 12. I'm not betting on that like straight up, right? But at wide receiver 40 prices, I'll bet on it 100%. So agree with that same process on Christian Watson, right? And then Brian Robinson, love that call as well. Even though it's a new coaching staff, so we don't know how they're going to use stuff. I'm still just really I'm searching for the fountain of youth for personal use, and I can't find it for me either. So he has better resources, maybe he has, but I mean I looked it up on Reddit and I can't find it, so I don't think it exists.
Yeah, I mean, if Reddit can't find it, it probably doesn't exist. So, all right, time for your 3 favorite values on Sleeper. Justin, who you got?
This first one's not a big one. David Montgomery going at RB20 on Sleeper, RB17 on Underdog. I just think even at RB17, like that's about like where I expect him to finish, give or take, but with the ability to have the upside to win me a championship if something happens injury wise, like we talked about earlier. We mentioned him as a name of guys you really want to have. At RB20, I just think he's being priced at his floor on Sleeper without any of the upside price baked in. Jalen Warren on Sleeper, RB32 on Underdog, RB24. Again, Underdog prices in the upside, and if he does take this job, it's a boom, boom thing. He's amazing, but he's probably pretty close to his floor at RB32, assuming you're a PPR league. We assume he'll have very similar usage to last year, where you would have been happy if you drafted him at RB32 last year because of the ability that he has to have some kind of boom games. Having to draft him at that price, I'm very happy to do it. He has the upside to be a high end RB2, potentially a low RB1, which is what you said you want to aim for if something happens to Najee Harris. We don't even know that he doesn't somehow win the job, right? So there's even non-injury related upside. And the last one, not a big gap here, Sleeper, QB15, Underdog, QB11. Just the fact that I can get somebody who has top 5 QB upside. I mean, if you listen to our hot take episode, my hot take, he's QB1 overall. I don't bet on that, but I wouldn't be surprised if he's QB5 or 6 this year just because of the rushing upside. And you get him outside of QB1s being drafted, like that to me is a steal for the upside that he has. So I absolutely love him as a value in Sleeper.
Yeah, I think those are some good picks. The 2 running backs you picked are great. They both have standalone flex value, RB2 value, and they definitely have that upside of if their running mate gets hurt, probably back end RB1, maybe even higher if you're really lucky. So those are definitely 2 great guys to invest in. And then Jaden Daniels, like you said, man, the upside is just impossible to ignore. If we're in a 1 QB league, like, you take Jaden Daniels, I probably want to roster a QB2, unless I know for sure I'm going to have good selections on the waiver wires. But still, even through the first couple of weeks, at least I want a guy just to protect myself in case he flops. Boy, if he hits, he's going to outperform that QB11 price tag on Underdog, even probably. I think those are all 3 very good picks there.
And now that we've been so positive again, I really feel the need for some negativity. David, can you start me out for some players that you think are overpriced on Sleeper comparatively to that Underdog ADP?
Yeah, perfect. Negativity. Let me talk about some Vikings. First one I'm going to mention, JJ McCarthy. He's QB1 on Underdog, QB23 on Sleeper. Look, until we know if he's going to be starting this year, it's hard to advocate drafting him in any redraft format. We've talked about it this whole episode. We don't like to hold 2 QBs, and even if we do, we're trying to get someone who's startable. This guy might not have a job. There's no real rushing upside. It's just really hard to see a world where I'm going to waste a roster spot on him early on in the season. Maybe if he takes the job and looks good, we pick him up on waivers. But I don't think I'm drafting JJ McCarthy in most redraft formats. And then I will talk about another Viking while we're on the subject, and that is Jordan Addison. We've got him as wide receiver 47 on Underdog, wide receiver 36 on Sleeper. And look, he's a young guy. He's got a chance at a year two breakout. If his quarterback hits, he could pay off that wide receiver 36 price fine. But we've been talking about a lot of guys in this range that we like, a lot of guys with upside that we like in this, fringe wide receiver 3 range. Even Deontay Johnson, who's priced at wide receiver 43 on Sleeper, a whole 7 wide receivers later. I'd rather have him. So there's just a lot of guys that I like more in this range. If you believe in the Vikings offense, Jordan Addison's your guy, fine. I don't think it's a horrible pick. I just really like the other players around him a lot more, so I don't expect to have any Addison personally. So then the last guy I'm going to mention, I already talked about him. I already gave my reasoning for him. I just feel like he's so overpriced in both of these host sites that I want to mention him twice. Nick Chubb, again, RB39 on Underdog, RB27 on Sleeper. I already gave my case for it, the age, the injury. That's just too high for me to invest in at RB27.
I think I already agreed with that one. So I'm not going to touch on the Chubb one. Definitely agree on the JJ McCarthy bit. He's a guy that I don't expect to be starting week one. I don't want to roster a QB that is not starting week one unless they had Jaden Daniels' athletic ability. And Jordan Addison, I mean, you mentioned Deontay Johnson going after him. I don't need any more convincing than that. Deontay Johnson's my favorite player ever. Not quite, but I love him at that value. Would definitely take him. Would definitely take other high upside guys after him. I would rather take a Christian Watson later than Jordan Addison there. So definitely agree with it. Although I think he'll be fine. I think he'll probably finish around wide receiver 36, but I don't want to draft wide receiver 36 at wide receiver 36. Not the play that I'm going for.
Exactly. So now for your 3 overpriced players on Sleeper, who you got, Justin?
So my first guy I'm going to mention here, piggybacking off of your underpriced player, Austin Eckler on Sleeper is RB31, on Underdog RB41, a gap of 10 spots. Again, I think it's just name value. And honestly, I think that it's going to be Brian Robinson there. I'm making the bet on Brian Robinson. I don't have any problem with taking Austin Eckler at a point where we've already taken everybody that we think is going to be a starting running back for sure. But at RB31, there's still a few guys that I would much rather take over him because I think, like we said, Fountain of Youth, the guy's probably washed. The next 2 guys are going to be rookies who are a little bit later on, but just players that I think we're just probably should maybe be avoiding until later on. Tyrone Tracy. Tyrone Tracy has a small gap here. I just wanted to kind of give the highlighting the point that I think we're a little low on Singletary and a little bit higher on Tracy. There's just some hate here that I'm not sure I fully understand. I think what David brought up about Brian Dable having experience with Singletary, they brought him in purposely. And Tyrone Tracy is going higher in both Sleeper and ESPN than he is on Underdog, which I think is just kind of interesting. The place that you're actually looking for the best case scenario and the upside isn't taking this guy. The place where people are spending money, to me, that's like somewhat informative of what is probably actually going to happen is the professional NFL running back who has years of experience, including with this coach, compared to the athletic guy who I think is a nice project, but has only been playing RB for 2 years at the collegiate level, was a wide receiver before then. I think I know who's the smart bet here, and I think that the money knows who's the smart bet, and that's why Singletary was a value because Underdog is higher on him, and Tracy is a overpriced player because Underdog is lower on him. I think there's a certain logic here that I wanted to highlight on where we should be making that bet, not that we can't be wrong. And the last one is a 10 pick gap between wide receiver 56 for Xavier Leggett and 66 on Underdog. I mean, there's 2 veteran wide receivers, Thielen and Deontay Johnson. I don't expect Thielen to have anywhere near the year he had last year, but I expect him to get 70, 80 targets, something like that. I expect Deontay Johnson to be a target hog there. And I expect Xavier Leggett to be a guy who maybe does some things in best ball, but I wouldn't be betting on it. And Underdog is not, the money is not betting on it. So for me, the fact that Bryce Young was not that good last year, this is just not a bet that I'm making. And it's not a bet that the smart money on Underdog is making compared to ESPN. So at that price, I'm probably off. If you want to pick him up off of waivers when someone drops him on a hope that in the second half of the season he does well, I'm all in on that, but I'm hands off at that price.
Yeah, I think those are all good selections. Obviously, I agree with the Eckler one based on picking Brian Robinson as a value. And the two rookies, like maybe they're going to give you some weeks later on in the season. Maybe Singletary gets hurt and Tracy takes over. Fine. I think they're probably both guys that deserve to start the season on waivers in almost every redraft league, though. And you'll probably be able to pick them up. Try to be a week early if you see a signs of breakout or something, but it's not going to kill you to miss on either of those guys. So I think those are all good selections. So now, just to kind of wrap this segment up, I think it's very easy to reproduce this and you can kind of use it in a draft by draft case. You can go to Underdog's website, you can get their ADP, you can download it into an Excel file really easily. I think on Fantasy Pros, the process is probably almost the same and they give you more than just Underdog's ADP. So, use your resources available to you. If you have questions on how to do that, let one of us know. We're happy to help walk you through that. But yeah, sometimes I'll pull up Underdog's ADP and just kind of use it as I go through one of my redraft leagues drafts. I'll eliminate players as they get drafted, just kind of as a way to see how that draft falls in Underdog, and it kind of helps me inform my decisions. But yeah, really easy to do if you feel like reproducing this work on your own.
All right, all right, all right. And moving on to some more of a little bit of a dynasty focus. So these are some players that either were higher or lower on for this season from a redraft standpoint. So let's bring it back to dynasty a little bit because we are still a dynasty podcast. And we're just going to look at some trades from dynasty-daddy.com that evaluate the value of some of these players. I'm going to throw to you first here, David, with Michael Pittman and a 26 first or Garrett Wilson.
Yeah, I think this is the structure of a trade that makes me at least stop and think. I just don't see Pittman and Garrett Wilson as close enough to make this as a tier down, in my opinion. I'm going to bet on the upside. I believe Wilson has a chance of being a tier one wide receiver at the end of this year. I think we've seen Pittman's ceiling, and I don't expect him to rise higher. That 26 first is early, maybe, but it's projected 26 first to be early at this point, anyways. So I think I'm going to go with Garrett Wilson pretty much exclusively.
Can't say I'm surprised with you on that one. Can't say that I disagree necessarily either. I mean,
I get thinking about it. I do. I get thinking about
I
it.
love the flexibility, but we know who Pittman is, and Wilson definitely has that upside. I think you can see a lot more expensive packages that have gotten paid for Wilson than this. So I think it's good value.
All right. And for you, Justin, we've got 12 teams start 10, half PPR, half tight end premium, taking Christian Kirk or Joe Mixon in a random 26 seconds.
I love Christian Kirk, but I'm taking the package, and it's not too close for me. So I think Christian Kirk's price is probably somewhere between 2 seconds and a second and a third, maybe a second and two thirds is like the maximum I'd pay for him. I think Mixon's probably worth about 2 seconds. I kind of look at this as if you had to ask me, do I want Christian Kirk or Joe Mixon? I have to look at roster construction to decide. But if you're giving me a 26 second, the Mixon side's a smash, and it's not particularly close for me.
I have to agree with you there. I think the Kirk versus Mixon straight up conversation maybe is a little more interesting, but like we say, we like to use real trades that actually happen to give us context, and this was one of them. So I think you are hitting the head on the nose there. Is that right?
Nose on that? It's something like that. I mean, we're not word doctors or anything around here. We do
Well,
dynasty. And start 9, David. Brian Robinson at a 25 second or Josh Jacobs?
I think this is a pretty even trade. Now we are in a start 9. I think for that fact, I'm probably going to lean Jacobs. If I'm trying to tier up into Jacobs, I want to make sure that's not my only second because I'd rather have the flexibility of the extra pick going into the season. But if I've got the cash to spend, I don't mind paying that price to tier up to Josh Jacobs there.
Yeah, at a start 9, I think I would be willing to pay that to improve as well. I agree there.
All right. And your next trade, Justin, 12 team start 11, full PPR, half tight end premium. Stephon Diggs in a 26 third or a 2026 first.
I'm probably taking the 26 first here. I can definitely see, of course, there's a chance I regret this and Diggs has a great year and I regret this for this year. But I can tell you that by this time next year, money that I lost from not winning a championship aside, I certainly would rather have the asset of the 26 first because there's no chance I'm getting the first for him there. I think that the difference between Diggs and even like a Romeo Dobbs from like a points per game standpoint is probably like I'd guess 3 to 4 points, something in that neighborhood. I expect Diggs to put up around 14 points a game, 15 points at the most. That's a pretty good season for him. I wouldn't be surprised if it's closer to like 13, 14. and a Romeo Dubs type, somebody that I can get for a third or 2/4 probably is gonna give me 10-ish points a game. I'd rather have 14, don't get me wrong, but I'd rather have the first than the difference between these guys, so I gotta take the first with how old he is and how quick he's gonna be worth nothing.
Yeah, I gotta say, as someone who has probably too much Stephon Diggs, he's not that easy to move right now. So if you got a trade where you can get a first for a small throw in, probably doing it most of the time. Maybe if an older team trying to make one last push at a championship, I could see holding the Diggs side. But man, if you can turn him into a first somehow, that's a major win.
And David, we're gonna go start 11, Debo and Zach Moss, or a 25 first and second.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting trade because Debo's cash price probably around a 25 first. Zach Moss cash price probably around a 25 second. So, you're kind of paying face value for these two guys. If you need the production, it makes sense. That being said, this close to the season, I don't love strapping myself by trading away my picks right now. So it really depends if I've got a couple extra draft picks lying around and I think I need a couple players to slot into my lineup. I don't think it's an unfair deal. I just think process probably most of the time I'm going to stick with the picks and split them up and use them as needed throughout the season rather than betting that I'll need these guys right now. But I don't think it's unfair. So
Yeah, I think I lean flexibility with you there, David.
and your next trade, Justin, 12 teams, start 11, full PPR, half tight end premium. We going with Ty Chandler and a 25 second or David Montgomery.
And in this case, I think Ty Chandler is a fine piece. He's the type of guy that I want to get back as a close to a throw in on trades. Probably worth about a third. You probably can't get a third round pick for him. That's probably like a fair value for the type of guy that he is. I would rather take Montgomery in a vacuum than this. However, if I am not competing, I want to get points off my roster. I'd try to push for a 25 second and third, or see if I can get a fourth added on, or see if I can get another backup running back or backup quarterback if I have open roster spaces that are guys I don't really want to roster, get a little more value back. But on a non-competing team, I'd probably take this liquidation price. Or I'd consider it, but I also might try to hold out for better in season. But it's fair. It's fair if you're not competing.
I think that's pretty much how I view it too. If I'm not competing, I'm willing to take the tier down. If I am competing, I think Montgomery is much more useful.
Yeah, Monty is one of my guys this year for sure. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Dino Construction Podcast. We know it was a little different this time, talking more redraft. We will be talking back just Dynasty, buy, sell, hold next week. So make sure to hit that subscribe button. Don't miss out on that episode. And from all of us here at the Dino Construction Podcast, until next time.